Hey everyone. Um, yeah, so I mean, just quickly, Giro-chan made a good point. Oh, Miguel, sorry, my bad. That the comments I made about native apps before are true in some cases. They're not true for things like ARC, which run Electron apps, which is a whole different story. I thought 2521 was always in C. Maybe that's changed. Okay. We've talked about HTTP and building HTTP servers, but then the next question is, okay, if you're building HTTP servers, you're going to have to test HTTP servers. And how do we test HTTP servers? And there's this kind of question that I posed in the slides, which is write a Flask server that can have its state reset, that can have its first and last name stored, that can access its first and last name, and it can have an optional parameter passed in that results as the first and last name being returned as uppercase or something, right? Just like a little spec, if you will. And then the next one is like, let's test this. So I've already written these files to save us some time. But basically, I'm just trying to test. We're going to test these two files. So we use two terminals for this. Now, these two files here are server and server test. Now I might open them as columns. Oh god, there we go. And we'll drag this out a little bit, make this a little bit smaller, and let's have a look at these two pieces of code, because hopefully now you're seeing like a lot of different Flask servers. The one on the left matters more at the moment because that's the actual Flask server. It's funny, yeah, I mean probably just a random tangent. It's just like seeing Taylor say that they nearly fell asleep. It's like probably the worst thing I've ever done in my life. It was my first year, and I was interning at a company, and I was living in like Maroubra, which is south of UNSW, and I was working in like around DY in the Northern Beaches, and I was working part time or something like this, and it took me like 3 hours to get to work. Not even exaggerating. Like the walk to the bus, and then the bus, and then through the city and on the beaches lines before they had the B lines and all of that. And I was so tired at this job because I started there at like 8:30. So I was like basically leaving home at like 5:30 to as like a programming intern at some tiny company. And I was always so tired. Like, and I'd get home at like 9 p.m. And one day I was like, those things you've all been at. Like I was like falling asleep at work. Like I'm like trying to focus, and I'm just like falling the hell asleep. Like the best time of the day was eating lunch, not because like I was hungry, but because when you eat, it's really hard to be tired, right? Like if you're eating food or chewing gum, it's really hard to fall asleep. So anyway, this one day, I was so tired working at my desk that I literally was just like working, and I just kind of started to drift and like get a bit wobbly. And then eventually on this one day I was so tired that I drifted so hard that my entire head just like fell forward. And I kind of woke up like mid-fall, but it was kind of too late by then because my body already had inertia. So I kind of woke up like I like fell, and I like woke up with my like here. And by the time I woke up, my head like hit the keyboard. But because I'd kind of woken up here, I like had immediately like pulled my head back. You know what I mean? And I was like, oh, that was horrific. And then I like turned and I see my colleague beside me, and he's just like staring at me because from his perspective, I've just been like sitting there working, typing. And he's just literally seen me like headbutt the keyboard. Like he's just seen me working and then just be like, stunk, like that. And he was like, are you all right? And I was like, yes, I'm swell. Anyway, being tired sucks. That's the moral of that story. So back to Flask servers. I have this really simple Flask server where I have a first name and a last name, and they're two global variables. And I've got 3 routes, right? Now, the post and the 2 post routes, reset and set, should be pretty straightforward to understand, right? The post route reset, it basically grabs the global variables and it resets them to be empty strings, and it returns nothing here. In fact, maybe just to be clear, I should probably have this return dumps of nothing, like that. So that's what reset does. It resets it. On the other side, when we call the set route, what happens with the set route is that we pull in the body from the post request, right? Request.getJSON gets the body from the post request. We extract the first name and last name variable from it, and then we set those global variables to be those values. And then we return those new values. So set will actually return the values it just set. So it's pretty similar to the point example where we're just using a post request or a put request to update something. So we do that. Great. And then the harder one is we have this info route. Now, just for simplicity for now, I'll actually use a simpler one of this, just so we don't overcomplicate the example yet. Okay. There. Something like that. So ignore the commented out code. And the info example is actually... frozen. The info route's actually really simple because all it's doing is it's literally just returning a JSON dump of the two global variables, right? So if I run this Python server, server.py, it runs on port 9002. Now, this is a simple program. Let's, though, have a look at our test for it. So I've got this file here called server test. And I want you to notice that I test this in 4 different parts, but let's worry about the fourth part later. And yep, okay, let's do this. So the first thing I do is I make a post request to my server on the reset route, right? You can see that I'm doing /reset. Now, something I've done just for general code cleanliness and, Pythonic code is I've actually realized I'm going to be calling the same URL multiple times. So I'm actually just going to go put it up here as a global variable, like a constant base URL. So then when I call it, it's just like, I'm just going to call the URL /reset. Now I call /reset at the start to make sure that everything is actually reset. You notice that I'm also doing this inside of like a test function in a test file. So I'm setting this up ready to use PyTest. So I call the reset function to reset it. Now I could actually, well, I can't really assert anything yet. The next thing I do is I call the /info route, right? And you know that the /info route simply returns us a first name and a last name. And I can extract that payload from that get response by calling r.json, where r is the request. That gives me the payload on the response. Well, r is the response here. So r gives me the payload on that response, and then I can actually check. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to assert that the first name property of that response is blank and the last name property of that response is blank, because that's what I expect a reset to do, right? And then after that, I'm going to make a post request to set this time. Now, what's the difference between set and reset? They're both post requests, but in the case of set, we're actually passing in a body, right? Parameters to the route, if you will, like parameters to the function. To pass in a body when you're using the request library to test, you after you give it the URL you want to call, you actually then give it a JSON argument where you give it the object you want to send. So the way requests work is it's like, send data to this, call this URL, and here's a Python object that I want you to send as JSON to that URL. So it'll send this basically as the body. So really easy to work with there. We'll get a response from that here, which is that we get the JSON of the response. Because remember, when we call set, it returns us what it set it to. It kind of echoes in a way, right? Like we say, oh, here's the first name and last name. And it's like, okay, I'll update them. And, here's the result. So we double check that it actually worked. We double check that first name is Hayden and last name is Smith here. Done. That's all well and good. And let's get rid of this bottom part for now. And let's just test all this work. So how would you test your server? Well, if you were testing it locally here. Oh my God, stop. TTTKKK says should reset be put because it loads every time and remains unchanged. Yeah, maybe it should probably be put or delete. I'd mainly put it as post here, I just try and change some things up in terms of like, the problem is like sometimes I'll put here and then students will think that like you can only have like one of each type or something. So it's kind of intentionally slightly wrong here to demonstrate a different behavior. But you're right, it should probably be post or delete. Put or delete, sorry, put or delete. So I'm going to run my, I'll actually run it down here, python3 server.py. So I'm running my server now, and now I'm going to run my pytest. So I want a pytest server test.py. You know how to do this. You'll notice that when I run it, it actually made 2 requests here, or 3. It actually called post get post. So you see it calls reset, then info, then set. And if I run my pytest again, it calls reset, then info, then set. So my pytests are actually using the request library to test if my server's functioning correctly. The other part of my server, which was the slightly weirder thing to test, is that the original spec for the info route, the one to actually get the data, said that there should be an optional parameter called UC, which stands for uppercase. And if that's present, then what you should do is return the uppercase values of the name. So basically, what that means is that, oops. Did I screw that up? What's happening? There we go. Yeah, so what this means is that what should happen here is that if I call the get again, right? Like if I was to call this again, and I was to say UC equals true, like that, then we would expect first name to be Hayden and the last name here to be Smith, right? Because if there is this variable in the URL, then this logic here will give us the uppercase version of it. So I've just used some like Python ternary if statements and stuff there. So I'm going to restart my server, going to run my test again, see if this works. Okay, this also passed. You saw it called 4 routes this time, one of them with the uppercase is true. You notice that if I don't do these asserts properly, it will fail, right? Just like a normal test. It's like, oh, sorry, but when I check this, Hayden is not equal to Hayden, and like that. But the last thing I want to emphasize is that writing out get variables manually in the string is actually kind of messy. So what you can do instead is you can actually say, you know what, this is the Python object. This is the dictionary that I'd like to encode. And then you can just put that in as the query string. So instead of this, you can actually just go query string. And this is a really helpful programming pattern here because it means that like if you have like 3 or 4 get variables, then you you basically can like do it in a dictionary format and then just pass it in through the URL like that. So I would strongly recommend you do something like that. And then when I run this again, it works. So we've written some tests for it. Sweet. So testing with request library in Python is actually super straightforward. TTTKKK says, how come it understands that equals true as a bool? It actually doesn't understand that equals true as a bool. It could be anything. It's actually the fact that it's like a non-zero. Like the fact that it's actually defined is what we're checking here essentially. So when we say like, when we get UC, this is just going to be some value. So we're more just checking if it's not false, which anything that isn't, if we, in fact, even if we had false here, I think it would work because false will be converted to a string, right? So false will be converted to a string here, and then the URL will basically be like question mark UC equals false, and like it's just a string. So when you decode it, it's just going to be like, oh, the variable UC is equal to the string false, and then it will just work. So this should even work as well. Yeah. True's just there so like it's easier for programmers to understand what's happening. Okay, great. So that's pretty much it. Like literally that's all there is to testing. The fundamentals of testing are really straightforward. It's like post get and like post put and delete are all the same. So you could literally like if you just took this code from the lecture slide repo, pretty much everything you do is just in the scope of this but more. So that's pretty much it on HTTP testing.